Hello and welcome to today's webinar on getting started in Lithuanian family history research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Vice President of Education and Programming here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is genealogist James Heffernan. James has been with American Ancestors since 2015. He is a graduate of Boston College, where he worked in the conservation department at the John J. Burns Library. His previous work experience also includes an internship at Plymouth-Patuxent in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And James is a frequent contributor to American Ancestors magazine, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, as well as our Vita Brevis blog. In his spare time, James scours eBay looking for family heirlooms. His areas of genealogical expertise include Central and Eastern Europe, with a particular focus on the former Polish territories of the Austrian, Russian, and German empires. Other specialties include Eastern Canada, colonial New England, and American immigration from 1890 to about 1920. Now, Lithuanians have been immigrating to America since as early as the 17th century, yet rapidly changing boundaries, unfamiliar languages, and late civil registration are just some of the challenges faced by family historians trying to trace their Lithuanian roots. Over the course of the next hour or so, James will provide you with a better understanding of the various waves of immigration to the United States, what types of records exist, and generally how to get started in Lithuanian family history research. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is a syllabus for this session that can be purchased from our online bookstore. You'll find a link to this downloadable PDF in your reminder emails, as well as in your follow-up email after today's broadcast. I'll also pop it into the chat panel in just a moment. We're also recording this event, and starting later today, you can freely go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website, as well as our YouTube channel. So if you miss something on today's first listen, don't worry, don't feel like you need to take, copious amounts of notes. You'll be able to go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to James.
Thanks, Ginevra. Welcome everybody to this webinar on getting started tracing your Lithuanian ancestry. I'm a specialist in Central and Eastern European genealogy, and I freely admit that Lithuanian genealogy is among the hardest in the region. We'll be going over the reasons why Lithuanian genealogy can prove so difficult, and I'll be introducing some strategies to set you on the path to locating your family in Lithuanian sources. It's important that we start with the discussion of the history of Lithuania. It's a very complex history. The area that's now considered Lithuania has expanded and contracted considerably in the last 400 years or so. At times, there was no Lithuanian state, and that can have a huge impact on how your ancestors reported their origins and the pressures that led to their immigration to North America. Here's a recent map of Central and Eastern Europe. Lithuania borders Poland, Belarus, Latvia, and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. Lithuania and Latvia share ethnic and linguistic roots dating back to the Indo-European Baltic tribes that settled the area during the Iron Age. However, for our purposes, it's important to look to Lithuania's east and west, the nations of Poland and Russia, which exerted tremendous influence on the Lithuanian territory from the Middle Ages through to the end of World War I. For much of that period, Lithuania belonged to a joint monarchy, part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at one time the largest and most populous nation-state in Europe. If we step back about 350 years, we'll find a very different Central and Eastern Europe. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was formed in the mid-16th century when the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Władysław Jagiełło, married Jadwiga, Queen of the Kingdom of Poland. Their dynastic union produced a kingdom that stretched from the Baltic Sea down through areas of modern-day Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. The kingdom was cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and towards the end of its existence, very poorly run. Poland exerted the dominant culture in the partnership. In the Commonwealth period, which ran until the late 18th century, the Lithuanian territories underwent a period of Polonization. Polish became the language of the nobility, and with Latin, the language of official record-keeping. The capital of the Commonwealth was initially in Krakow, in the far southern reach of the kingdom. It was later moved up to Warsaw to be more central. Property in the Commonwealth was reserved largely for the noble class, who owned large estates where peasant labor drove agricultural wealth. The nobility belonged to the legislative arm of the Commonwealth, known as the Sejm, which held considerable control over what laws the king could enact. The legislature initially functioned under a majority voting principle, but later adopted a privilege called liberum veto, which required unanimous consent among the nobility for any legislation to pass. It paralyzed the Polish-Lithuanian state and made it susceptible to influence from outside nations like Prussia, Austria, and Russia, who had been gaining in military strength in the intervening years. In a series of agreements between those three growing empires at the end of the 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was broken up, with Prussia, Austria, and Russia gaining large swaths of territory. The territories absorbed by the Russian Empire included the majority of the old Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Lithuanian territories saw another cultural shift away from Poland and now towards Russia. Compulsory military service was established, ranging from 25 years at the start of the 19th century to 6 years by the close of it. Movement was restricted throughout the empire, especially for Jewish families who were not allowed to leave their home province without permission. The empire was divided into gubernias, or governorates, which you can think of as similar to our concept of a state. The Lithuanian territories were split between the Kovno, Vilna, and Suwalk gubernias. Each gubernia was then divided into administrative districts, which were comprised of neighboring towns and villages. These administrative layers are very important in Lithuanian genealogy. In the same way that nearly every state in this country has a town named Springfield, you'll find the same town and village names across districts and gubernias in the Russian Empire. Our hope is that when it comes time to research in Lithuanian sources, we're armed with all the information we need to be positive we're searching in the correct area, and we'll talk about more of that in a bit. In the 1850s, we see the introduction of Russian, written using the Cyrillic alphabet, into official documents including church and vital records. Keep in mind that these official languages existed simultaneous to the Lithuanian or Yiddish that was spoken at home. In 1861, the Tsar abolished serfdom throughout the empire. While the net effect was that peasant laborers were no longer tied to particular estates and now legally free to purchase land, the majority of property remained consolidated in local landlords who leased their land out to peasant farmers. As the century went on, and after several failed uprisings, the Russian Empire tightened its grip on its Lithuanian territories, banning the Lithuanian language outright and substituting Russian as the de facto language in the public sphere. The empire was also very slow to industrialize. What industrialization they did promote favored areas further west of Lithuania, areas now squarely within Poland. This left the Lithuanian territory reliant on the success of each year's agricultural yield to sustain local economies. It wasn't really a recipe for success. And it bred unrest as Lithuanian nationalism ebbed and flowed. But within that movement, there were still questions of whether the goal was to return to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or a much scaled back, independent, and predominantly ethnically Lithuanian state. At the conclusion of World War I, Lithuania was reconstituted, albeit on a much smaller scale than the traditional lands of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Lithuanian became the official language of record-keeping and education. Place names that had been officially known by Polish and Russian alternatives were now written in Lithuanian. The new Lithuanian state faced incursions from east and west as the Soviet Union attempted to seize territory, and the newly reformed Polish state claimed large portions of majority ethnic Lithuanian regions. During the Russian Empire, the differences were much less stark. A general trend had emerged where larger urbanized areas retained a Polish identity, while the surrounding rural areas were decidedly Lithuanian. It's difficult to form nation states based on ethnic identity without excluding those who feel a different nationalist urge, and including those who don't feel Lithuanian at all. Nowhere was this more clear than the area of the former Suwałk gubernia, which was split between Poland and Lithuania, and where today you still find large populations of ethnic Poles in Lithuania and ethnic Lithuanians in modern Poland. In the interwar period, borders continued to shift as wars were fought against the Soviet Union and Poland. Here's our view of the Republic of Lithuania in the period 1920 to 1940. The areas shaded in green represent the bounds of the Lithuanian Republic, while the areas in gray show territories ceded and sometimes contested with Poland, who also regained its independence following World War I. The gubernias and districts of the Russian period were replaced by the apskritis, essentially a county. This was the geopolitical arrangement until the start of World War II, when Nazi Germany invaded the area. Following World War II, we enter the communist period of Lithuania's history, exemplified by a cold Soviet-era apartment complex. The Lithuania that emerged out of World War II was demographically very different. The large Jewish population that had lived in the region for 600 years was decimated during the war. The remaining population was overwhelmingly Lithuanian-speaking and Roman Catholic. However, the communist state was officially non-religious, and many churches were closed in this period. The records from each parish and diocese were transferred to the state archives, where they were cataloged and remain today. This particular quirk of Lithuanian genealogy is of exceptional value to us as researchers. Because of the mass transfer of church records into the National Archives system, it eliminates the need to determine if a community's records are still at the church or in a county civil record office or a state or national archive. Lithuanian nationalism continued to build until the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's program of perestroika that allowed for a new political direction. Today, the Republic of Lithuania has the largest economy of the 3 Baltic states and is a member of the European Union. So we've just been through hundreds of years of Lithuanian history in a very short time, so it might be helpful to summarize what we've learned so far, at least genealogically speaking. Lithuania has been through many demographic and border shifts in its history. This complicates our research as the towns where our ancestors lived were under different jurisdictions and languages over time. Lithuanian genealogy is sometimes Polish genealogy, and other times it's Russian genealogy. Without knowledge of an ancestor's precise place of origin, it's exceedingly difficult to move forward with research in Lithuanian sources. But what ultimately motivated our Lithuanian ancestors to come to the United States? Well, it had a bit to do with the compulsory military service required under the Russian Empire. Especially when we talk of the period 1890 to 1920, when the largest wave of Lithuanian immigration occurred, the Russian Empire was increasingly unstable, both internally and through larger conflicts. After decades of political and social oppression, it's not surprising that the young men of Lithuania were unwilling to lay their lives on the line for the Russian Tsar. Then there's the issue of the population exceeding available property. I'm quoting here from an article by James S. Pula and published in a recent issue of the journal Polish American Studies. By 1875, some 1 million acres of former landed estates in the Russian Empire were in peasant hands. However, the population doubled in the quarter century between 1875 and 1900, an expansion that brought about the subdivision of farms through inheritance. At a time when it was estimated that the average family required 14 acres to support itself, fully 64% of small farms fell below that threshold. As a result, the number of landless peasants grew by 286%. Now, if you add to this equation Russian attempts at suppressing Lithuanian language and culture and the frequency of pogroms targeting Jewish families in the region, it becomes fairly clear why so many people left Lithuania. At the same time, the United States had comparatively lax immigration policies. As Lithuanian immigrants settled in the United States, seeking greater safety and economic opportunity, word spread and new immigrants were pulled into growing Lithuanian American communities. This is called chain migration, where the success of one immigrant fuels the immigration of another. Often an immigrant would leave for the United States shortly after their marriage, saving enough money to finance the migration of the remainder of the family. Many immigrants intended to reside in the United States only temporarily, earning money in the winter and returning to agricultural work in Lithuania in the spring. You might find when you research in immigration sources that your ancestor went back and forth a few times. Generally, once the rest of the family joined them in the United States, they settled permanently. This map shows the areas of the United States where Lithuanian immigrants settled most densely. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Illinois received the largest proportion of Lithuanians in the period 1890 to 1920. California, our fourth state with the highest Lithuanian population, saw many of its Lithuanian immigrants arrive in the period following World War II and before the breakdown of the Soviet Union. If there's one thing that you take away from this webinar, I hope it's that you must first exhaust all American sources to find your ancestors' precise origins in Lithuania before going after sources in Lithuania. There's no unified database of church and vital records from Lithuania, so it's best to be methodical and check off all the go-to American sources first. You might start by looking at census records, which document the household composition in a given census year. In the United States, the census is taken every 10 years. The 1890 census no longer survives, but census returns from 1880 and from 1900 to 1950 are searchable across a bunch of free and subscription genealogy websites. 20th century census records include citizenship and immigration information. Questions like the year of immigration, whether naturalized, and if so, what year. Census records also expose us to the many ways a Lithuanian surname can be butchered. Census takers often had no familiarity with the primary language of respondents, so a range of phonetic possibilities is not only common, but should be entirely expected. I also recommend considering a wide range of birth dates for your ancestors. Most Lithuanian immigrants, unless they retained a copy of their birth or baptismal record, were unaware of their specific birth date. It's not uncommon to find someone's reported birth year jumping around between censuses, sometimes swinging 5 to 10 years in either direction. The context, where the person is living and other members of the household, should help confirm that you have the right person. Also keep in mind that while the census taker might have had trouble recording your ancestor's name, the transcriber who decades later provided the index information for the online database might have also struggled to read the census taker's handwriting. Always look at the original image for any records and judge for yourself. Here are a couple of census records for the Norkunas family of Chicago, Illinois. The proper Lithuanian spelling of the surname is at the bottom of the slide. The upper image is from 1910 and shows Joe Norkunas, with a C, not a K, born in Russian Lithuania, who immigrated in 1900, or it kind of looks like 1908, and under his citizenship recorded as AL, meaning alien. He was not yet naturalized. Ethel Norkunas, Joe's wife, also born in Russian Lithuania, has an immigration year of 1905. A decade later, the image below, we have the same family. Joe's birthplace is Lithuania, reflecting the fact that an independent Lithuanian state had reemerged between the census years, and his immigration year is given as 1900, confirming what we saw in the earlier census. Here, his response to the citizenship question was PA, which stands for papers. He was in the process of applying for citizenship. If he'd been naturalized, you could expect the letters NA in that column. Ethel's immigration year is now listed as 1900, not the 1905 we saw in the earlier census. So further research will have to prove out which of those dates is correct. Here's a helpful tip for working around the many ways a Lithuanian surname can appear in American records. Use wildcard searches whenever you can. An asterisk symbol can be used to substitute multiple letters in a search term. A question mark replaces a single letter in the search term. For example, if we look at the search I've built on the right, in the first name field, I've opted for just a J and the asterisk symbol. This will return any first names that begin with J. Something tells me that Joe Narkūnas was not born with the name Joe in Lithuania in the 1880s. Any Lithuanian names beginning with a J will also appear in the search results. With the last name, if we consider the parts of the surname that differed between the two census years in the last example, then a search where the CU or KU in the surname is replaced by the asterisk symbol and the last vowel in the surname ending is replaced with a question mark should yield surnames that phonetically approach the surname Narkūnas. The more you use wildcards and see the results that you can get, the more accessible to you they'll become. There's another reminder here to make use of the date ranges offered on many database search pages so you don't miss a result because the birth date was recorded incorrectly. And I have a few comments about Lithuanian naming conventions. Some Lithuanian first names very neatly translate into English names. Most Marijonas become Marianas or Marys. Most Juozapas become Josephs in the United States. However, there are many Lithuanian first names that don't have direct translations into English. Don't assume an ancestor's Lithuanian name until you have the documentary evidence to back it up. You can put more stock into records where a surname was written by a Lithuanian speaker. For our purposes, this will most often be in American church records where the priest was a member of the Lithuanian community. There are also some grammatical conventions to be on the lookout for because Lithuanian surnames change depending on the noun case and the person they describe. Lithuanian women have different versions of their surname based on whether they're married or unmarried. Usually, once a family settled in the United States, their surname was standardized to match the masculine form. Even long after the demise of the Russian Empire, many Lithuanian American families retained their Russified surnames, choosing to stick to the surname as it appeared in their immigration records and earliest records in the United States. The phonetic differences between Russian and Lithuanian can lead to a surname looking very different when the two forms are compared. For example, let's take the different iterations of the Lithuanian surname Klemarauskas. These records are all pertaining to Aleksandras Klemarauskas and stretch from his marriage in Lithuania in 1891 to his obituary 40 years later. The marriage record is written in Russian, reflecting the official use of Russian in Lithuania at that time. In 1892, he immigrated to the United States under a phonetic version of his Russian surname, Klemarovsky. The record from 1911 comes from the baptismal record of his son at a Lithuanian Roman Catholic church in Massachusetts. Here the name is represented in its correct Lithuanian form. The 1930 census has the name starting with a C instead of a K, and his obituary opts for a Polish-like spelling that includes an N before the suffix. In this case, searching with wildcards was essential. Next, let's take a look at naturalization records, which when paired with immigration records are your best bet for finding an ancestor's exact birthplace in the old country. Before 1906, naturalizations were handled in a variety of federal, state, and local courts. The information found on each petition also varied, but almost always included the address of the applicant, their birthplace, their arrival date in port, and the names of two witnesses. After 1906, naturalization records expanded to include information for the applicant's spouse and children, the ship that they arrived on, and a recent photograph. After 1906, each naturalization file was kept in triplicate. One copy went to the applicant, one copy stayed with the court where the naturalization took place, and the third was forwarded to the federal government. If your ancestor naturalized after 1906, you can request a copy of their record from the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. The earliest naturalization records commonly name only the applicant's country of birth. Some later naturalization records include a certificate from the Immigration and Naturalization Service connecting the reported date of immigration to the original manifest, confirming the name that the applicant traveled under. Naturalization was handled in 3 phases. First, an immigrant would signal their intention to naturalize. Then, after a prescribed waiting period, they would petition the court for naturalization. Then, a naturalization certificate would be issued. If in your census record research, your ancestor's citizenship is noted as PA, which you'll recall means papers, that means that the immigrant had filed a naturalization intention. For naturalization records prior to 1906, you'll find a range of state-specific naturalization databases at Ancestry.com. Some records have also been digitized at FamilySearch.org. Here's an example of a declaration of intention to naturalize filed in the U.S. District Court for Chicago. The applicant, Joseph Iwinski, includes information on his address, nationality, birth date, and birthplace, recorded here as Varnius, Lithuania. This intention is dated after 1906, so it includes additional information like the birthplace and immigration information for his spouse and the names, birth dates, and birthplaces of their children. Joseph's wife, Mary, was born in the town of Pagramantis, Lithuania. The section just above the photograph records the date and place of arrival in the United States. Joseph Iwinski reports that he entered the United States on the Crown Prince Wilhelm, which arrived to New York from Bremen, Germany on October 21st, 1913. Oddly, he arrived under the name Franciscus Gariba, totally unexpected and probably overlooked when searching in passenger records. Without this record, we may never have found his passenger record. Which brings us to passenger records. The manifest that records an ancestor's arrival to the United States is one of the most reliable sources for their origins abroad. A passenger list or manifest includes an immigrant's birthplace and after 1907, the names of friends and relatives in their country of origin, as well as who an immigrant would be joining in the United States. Lithuanian immigrants didn't always arrive through northeastern ports like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or Baltimore. Steamship companies offered reduced fares for immigrants that traveled through Canada to the United States, so it's worth looking at border crossing records as well. If an ancestor arrived in the United States as a citizen of the Russian Empire, talking about the period from the 19th century through to the end of World War I, they were most likely recorded under the Russian form of their surname. If an ancestor arrived between 1918 and 1940, they likely traveled under the Lithuanian form of their surname, complete with gendered and marital status-specific suffixes. Many passenger lists are difficult to decipher. Always inspect the original image and confirm the information transcribed in a record. Passenger lists after 1907 are 2 pages in length. Be sure to navigate to the second page where you'll find, among other items, an immigrant's point of contact in the United States, dates of prior immigration to the United States, and their birthplace. There's a persistent myth that family surnames were altered upon arrival to the United States. Rather, surnames evolved to adapt to an English-speaking world where vital record clerks, draft registrars, and census takers struggle to accurately record Lithuanian surnames. Your ancestor's name on their passenger manifest should reflect how their name was recorded in official sources in their country of origin. There were no deliberate name changes at Ellis Island. Here's an example of the first page of a passenger manifest from 1922. Everyone on the page is Lithuanian. If we follow the red arrow to number 10 on the manifest, we find passenger Mariona Zametskaita, a 20-year-old single woman. Her surname includes the feminine unmarried ending to the surname. As you move across the page, you'll notice some handwritten notation with a series of numbers followed by the date 10/29/39. This is a reference to Mariona's naturalization record. Part of her application included a check by the Immigration and Naturalization Service to confirm her date and port of entry. The next two fields beyond the dated notation is her last foreign residence and the contact information for a relative or friend in her country of origin. Mariona listed her brother Casimir of Lilavani in Tauregi Apskritis. The last column on this page gives her intended destination of Chicago. Here's the second page. Following again on line 10, there's information for who she's joining in the United States and their address. The last column is crucial as it contains her birthplace, recorded as Pagramontala. Mariona would eventually marry Joseph Avinsky from our naturalization example. Recall that his naturalization intention includes that his wife Mary had been born in the town of Pagramantis, Lithuania. So we now have two versions of what seems to be the same place name. The trick is going to be determining which is correct, or at least the closest to being correct. If the passenger list that includes your ancestor notes that their ship left from the port of Hamburg in Germany, there's a corresponding outgoing manifest that survives. Ancestry.com has a separate database for Hamburg departure lists. This is especially useful in situations where a place name is difficult to make out on the American record. A different record by a different hand might be a bit easier to interpret. Unfortunately, Hamburg is the only one of the main continental European ports to retain their outgoing passenger lists. If we're ranking the probability of finding an ancestor's birthplace in an American record, naturalization records, immigration records, and church records are the big three. Let's explore why. If your ancestors were Roman Catholic, they likely joined an established Lithuanian American community that supported its own Roman Catholic parish, or were integrated into the many Polish Roman Catholic churches that also sprung up in cities with large Central and Eastern European immigrant populations. In either event, the baptismal, marriage, and burial registers of Roman Catholic churches can be full of useful identifying information for your Lithuanian ancestors. It's simple. Lithuanian parishes tended to have Lithuanian priests. The Polish churches had Polish priests who might be able to speak Russian as a lingua franca with their Lithuanian parishioners, but who also had an understanding of the geography of the area. The nature of the partnership, then divisions between Poland and Lithuania, meant that a highly educated Polish priest would be familiar with the Polish versions of Lithuanian place names. Roman Catholic marriage records often include the parish where the bride and groom were born. These records are also very important for the connections they reveal between your ancestral family and the larger Lithuanian immigrant community. If you're unable to find the precise origins of your ancestor, you should expand your research to the godparents and witnesses attached to your family's church records. This is an example of a 1916 marriage record between two Lithuanian parishioners of a Polish Roman Catholic church. The record is written in Latin, but includes the native parishes of the bride and groom written using their Polish forms. They were from different parishes within Volkomiesh County in Kovno gubernia. Unfortunately, immigration and naturalization records are generally much more accessible to us as genealogy than church records. Church records might still be at the parish church where they were created. They might have been moved to another church as parishes were closed or consolidated, or they might be in a diocesan archive. It can be prickly getting access to church books at the original parish and largely left to the whims of the parish administrator or the parish priest. If the church books have been centralized with a higher church authority, there will usually be information online about booking appointments or sending requests for record copies. And increasingly, many Catholic records are being digitized and placed online. Our website, AmericanAncestors.org, has digitized images from the Archdiocese of Boston up to about 1920. Those records include a number of Lithuanian parishes in South Boston, Brockton, Cambridge, Lawrence, Lowell, and Norwood. If your ancestor belonged to a church in Chicago, many of those records have been digitized by FamilySearch.org and are available to browse through their online catalog. If your ancestor lived in a large city, finding church records is not as simple as locating the nearest Lithuanian or Roman Catholic church. Sometimes, though, you can use information from a civil record to guide you to the correct church record. This is the civil record that corresponds to the church record we were looking at a few slides ago. The final column of the register includes the name of the officiant and their address. This is not unique to Massachusetts vital records. Most 20th century marriage records will include the name of the officiant or the address where the marriage took place. This record states the marriage was performed by Henry Zmayevsky, priest, on Otis Street in Cambridge. When I searched for the name Henry Zmayevsky and the terms Otis and Cambridge, I found a Google result linking to a directory of Roman Catholic parishes in the early 20th century. Recognizing that Henry Zmayevsky was the rector of St. Hedwig's Parish in Cambridge gave me the information I needed to seek out the church copy of that 1916 marriage record. So let's say you've located, or let's say that you've looked at naturalization, immigration, and church records and still have no idea exactly where your ancestor was from. Or you have a nice long list of place names. Some look Polish, some look Lithuanian, and others you can't make heads or tails of. Then it's time to expand the focus. Ironically, by expanding your search to people other than your ancestor, you'll be able to hone in on information specific to your ancestor. In genealogy, we call that fan research, referring to the friends, associates, and neighbors of your target ancestor. We fundamentally assume that your ancestors surrounded themselves with people who shared cultural, linguistic, and familial origins. These names can come from a range of records. It could be a boarder found in your ancestor's household in a census record, or the witnesses found on a naturalization record, or among the men and women who are part of the same community organizations as your ancestor. By researching those people, you may notice a pattern where most are from a specific area in Lithuania. Or it might just yield another variation of a place name, this time close enough to place a pin on the map where your family originated. I want to remind you of some of the common pitfalls we encounter in Lithuanian genealogy. First, a reminder that birth dates can vary across years and record types. Frustratingly, many of the records we rely upon to give exact information for an ancestor's origin come up severely lacking. Immigrants commonly named the nearest city or town, or perhaps only the gubernia where they were born, leaving you to wonder if your ancestor was from Kovno gubernia, the Kovno district, or perhaps its namesake, the city of Kaunas. When you hit that dearth of information, it's important to keep going. Keep researching and expand your focus. The answer is probably out there. So I want to conclude the webinar by running through some additional sources that might contain information useful in tracking down your ancestral town or village. It's all about accumulating as many sources as possible. We've spoken about using a marriage record to find church records, but birth and death records are also worth finding. In most cases, you'll see only the birth country on marriage and death records. Death records are only as reliable as the person who provided the information. This was very often the child of an immigrant ancestor who might have had limited knowledge of their grandparents in the old country. As a result, the names of the deceased parents are often rendered using English first names, despite the fact that that generation never immigrated to the United States. Death records often include burial information. If your ancestor was buried in a cemetery that was maintained by a certain church or synagogue, you should look into what records might be held by that religious institution. Throughout the 20th century, there were numerous Lithuanian language newspapers in circulation in the United States. I've listed a few on this slide, but the syllabus contains a more detailed list of the largest newspapers and how to access and search their archives. The website spauda.org has many digitized newspapers available for free. You'll want to check if your ancestor had an obituary published in one of those newspapers. You might also find that your ancestor was active in a community group that was reported on by the newspaper. There are also columns for people seeking information on friends and relatives whose contact information was lost after they immigrated. Here's an example of an obituary found in a Lithuanian language newspaper. They're very often this rich in detail, including the exact birthplace of the deceased, how long they'd been living in the United States, and the names of their surviving family members in the US and often back in Lithuania too. When the funeral is described, that will also point you towards the church that might hold additional records for your family. You can expect the Lithuanian form of your ancestor's name in these newspapers. It should be noted too that many Lithuanian immigrants had obituaries published in English language newspapers as well, and those sometimes do include the place in Lithuania where they were born. In the interwar period, 1918 to roughly 1940, many Lithuanian immigrants retrieved copies of their birth, baptismal, and marriage records to assist with the naturalization process and later to apply for Social Security benefits. Check with older relatives to see if any documentation survives. This may also include photographs and letters sent between Lithuania and the United States. There are social media groups focused on genealogical translations, or you may choose to hire a translator. The website of the Association of Professional Genealogists has a searchable directory that includes Lithuanian researchers and translators. Many Jewish Lithuanian immigrants belong to a Landsmannschaft, which were organizations of people from the same town, shtetl, or region of Central or Eastern Europe. The groups were meant to facilitate acclimation and community following immigration. Within many Landsmannschaft was a burial society, responsible for the purchase and maintenance of graves for the organization. These were particularly common in the Jewish communities of New York City, with the Jewish Genealogical Society of New York estimating that there were over 3,000 by the beginning of World War II. Landsmannschaft plots, like the one pictured here, often have an entry gate denoting, in Yiddish, the organization and origins of those buried inside. Some Landsmannschaft records are held by the American Jewish Historical Society. In addition, many synagogues were founded by families with their roots in the same communities back in the Old Country. If you've been unable to find an ancestor's birthplace using American sources, and your research of their friends, associates, and neighbors also yields very few clues, then consider having your autosomal DNA tested. By grouping your DNA matches by the ancestor you must be related through, you can infer your ancestor's place of origin. Where you encounter DNA matches with fragmentary family trees, complete the tree yourself, noting the birth locations for their Lithuanian ancestral lines. The My Maps feature available from Google can help visualize the areas where your Lithuanian DNA matches overlap. In the example on the slide, after plotting the birthplaces found in family trees of DNA matches, we've concluded that our target ancestral Lithuanian family was likely from the northwestern part of modern Lithuania. Parishes and towns that continually appear in the trees of our matches are contenders for being the hometowns or parishes of our target ancestors. Ancestry DNA has the largest pool of American testers to compare to. However, 23andMe and MyHeritage are more popular DNA testing services among Europeans. As of May 2023, MyHeritage allows users to upload raw DNA files from other services to their website. While it'll grow your pool of Lithuanian testers, if their family trees aren't complete, it can be much more difficult to determine where that connection lies. Step 3 in Lithuanian genealogy is making sense of the place names that you've found in American sources. This is the last step before moving to records in Lithuania. Gazetteers were usually sponsored by the government to serve as an atlas of places within the country or empire. Entries are usually broken down into the administrative districts and public offices for each place. They also often contain information about the nearest Catholic, Lutheran, Orthodox, or Jewish place of worship. One thing to note, however, is that they're specific to their publication dates. So, for example, if you consulted a gazetteer published in 1900, it'll give you a screenshot of how the town was organized at that time. Next, we'll go over a couple of gazetteers and some gazetteer substitutes. Lietuvos Zemėlapis is based on data from a 1939 map of Lithuania. Richard Gustaudis has compiled all Lithuanian place names into a database that includes alternate forms of the town name and its location in Lithuania. Pay very careful attention to the How to Use the Gazetteer section on the homepage, as navigating the map can be quite challenging. A useful resource for Jewish and non-Jewish ancestry alike, the Jewish Gen Communities database consolidates all the official and linguistic variations of a place name and describes the administrative structure from the 19th and 20th centuries. Searching the Polish, Yiddish, Russian, or Lithuanian form of a town name should yield the same results. Here's a sample of some search results. If we pay attention to the top one, the first result, that's for the town of Varnai, Lithuania, and you'll see that there are 11 alternate names given and the administrative breakdown ranging from after World War II to the interwar period of the 1930s and from just before World War I. If your ancestors were Jewish, each community entry will also include links to genealogical resources and the names of nearby Jewish communities. I also want to direct your attention to some of the useful groups that can be found on social media. I belong to several Eastern and Central European genealogy groups on Facebook. They're an excellent environment for tips and research strategies. Experienced researchers may be able to point you towards resources or quick translations of records in Lithuanian or Russian. If you're feeling stuck in your research, post what you know and what you're hoping to find and see what people suggest. This is particularly useful if you have an array of place names, but have been unable to find out exactly where in Lithuania they're supposed to be. The phonetic versions of the place name might be obvious to a group member who's familiar with Lithuanian geography. And once you've been able to drop a pin into the exact place in Lithuania that your ancestor was born, now it's finally time to research resources in Europe. Due to the changing borders of Lithuania, records are sometimes scattered. Church records might be held by the Lithuanian State Historical Archives or a branch of the National Archives of Poland. If your ancestors were Jewish, there have been several large-scale efforts to transcribe Jewish vital records from Lithuania and also along the Polish border at websites like Jewish Gen, the Litvak Special Interest Group, and the website of Jewish Records Indexing Poland. If your ancestors were Roman Catholic, there's a very good chance that their records have survived back to at least the turn of the 19th century. The earliest church books will be in Latin, then Polish, then Russian, and finally Lithuanian. Duplicate copies of vital records were transferred to a deanery, and those registers have also been transferred to the Lithuanian State Historical Archives. So not only is there a good chance that the original record books survived, but any record loss might be covered by the duplicate copies that had been sent to the deanery authority. Winding down, let's review some of the key themes from the webinar. A basic understanding of Lithuanian history can help make sense of changing personal names and place names in your family tree. You should accumulate all American records for your ancestor first, asking yourself what the preponderance of the evidence suggests. If you struggle to find your ancestor's birthplace, expand your focus to associated individuals. They might share origins. Finally, put the place names that you've found into context by looking at gazetteers. Then you'll finally be ready to research in European sources.
All right, well, thank you so much, James. Before we get to your questions, I do want to tell you about a few upcoming programs. There's still time to register for our spring stay-at-home program. You can attend 6 lectures, 6 group activities and demonstrations, all from the comfort of your home, and all on the theme of filling in the dash, uncovering ancestral stories. And as a participant, you'll also receive 2 one-on-one virtual consultations with our experts. So that is June 8th through the 10th. And as I said, you can still register. There's still room. On June 13th, Rhonda McClure will discuss some different calendar systems that you may encounter in your family history research. And then starting on June 14th, we begin a 3-week online course on researching impoverished ancestors in North America. You can learn about these and all of our online and in-person programs at americanancestors.org/events. All right, so let's get to some questions. A few questions about naturalization and citizenship. First, could you say a bit more about someone having first papers and what that actually means, and where you're likely to find those first papers, especially if no other citizenship records can be found?
Sure. So there was a prescribed waiting period as a part of the naturalization process. So the papers essentially means that you've declared your intention to become a citizen of the United States. So you've filled out that form with all the information that it requires. And then depending on the time period, there's a certain amount of time you have to wait. You have to have been a resident in the country a certain amount of time before you can legally become a citizen. So you register your intention and then you wait the prescribed amount of time and then you file your naturalization petition, and then they grant it or they don't. Now, the intention and the declaration and intention and petition and ultimately the certificate that's issued is going to live at whatever court was used to naturalize. What can be tricky about that is that before 1906, there were a lot of different courts who held jurisdiction over citizenship. So it can be difficult figuring out exactly if it was a police court, if they went through a federal court, a state court. There are a lot of indexes online. Ancestry.com has a pretty robust database of indexes that covers those earlier records that at the very least would point you towards the court that has the original record. After 1906, it's simplified in that a copy was sent to the federal government regardless of which court handled the naturalization. So there's a copy that's attached to the federal government that's sitting. They haven't been transferred to the National Archives yet. They're still with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, and they have a genealogy program available through their website where you can ask them to search for any immigration documents related to your ancestor. So it'll pick up any naturalization records or any later records as a part of their naturalization file, and they'll give you an estimate for the cost. You pay them, they send you the record.
And so if you can't find naturalization or say passenger lists online, and maybe it's before 1906, so it's through a court, where are those kind of original court records likely to be held, or does it depend?
It does depend. The original courts, whatever their successor court was, probably has an archive with a lot of that material. A very large number of them were microfilmed and have been digitized at FamilySearch.org. So if you're not familiar with searching through the catalog at FamilySearch, I'm not talking about going through the list of databases. I'm talking about going and hitting the catalog button on that main search page and typing in a place name there. A lot of naturalization records are digitized and are available for free online through the catalog at FamilySearch.
Great. A few questions about other types of church records that you might find in Lithuania. So Shannon asks, can you find synagogue records for Jewish families in Lithuania? We also have a question from Liza about Reformed evangelical churches in Lithuania. Again, are those records likely to survive, and where would you find them?
The answer is yes. In that same period in which I talked about the Roman Catholic records being transferred from the parishes to the National Archives, this was during the communist period, that included all religious denominations. So if the registers still existed, they should have been transferred to the Lithuanian State Historical Archives. The caveat to that is that in some of these areas that were disputed between Poland and Lithuania, some of those records may have ended up in the Polish National Archive system. That's kind of one of the difficult things in doing research in Lithuania, is if you were from one of those border areas, it can be really tough trying to track down whether the Lithuanian archives have it or the Polish archives do. Now, the other thing to note about some of those other denominations is that I didn't really focus on what was going on during World War I or World War II, but obviously in areas that saw heavy fighting during those conflicts, there's always the possibility that record books were destroyed. And when record books tend to be destroyed, we're talking about a lot of Jewish records because the community is no longer there to transfer them over to the National Archives. So sometimes we don't know what happens to these synagogue record books. I would imagine it's similar for some of the Protestant denominations that suddenly were very much a minority after World War II.
Let's see, we also have a few questions about different foreign enclaves within Lithuania. So, Maria asks, do you have any information or sources or maybe first steps in researching, again, these foreign enclaves in Lithuania? Someone else is asking about ethnic Germans living in Lithuania. Any kind of unique strategies there?
It's a lot of the same research strategies because the way that record keeping was stipulated within the Russian Empire, it was regardless of what religious group you belong to. The key there is that records, what we would consider vital records, were maintained by the religious community. So every religious group, there could have been several in the same town, would have been registering the births, marriages, and deaths for the people who belong to their respective religious group. And it's ultimately what happens with those records that they either end up in the archives or they don't, and that governs really what kind of research you can do there.
All right, thank you. Sharon has kind of the exact location in Lithuania where her ancestors are from. So you mentioned kind of a next step, learning what records exist for your specific area. How do you do that?
There's a website called Lithuanian Roman Catholic Ancestors.com that this guy, I think he lives in the Chicago area, he has compiled all of these how-to guides for determining which records for what time frames have made it to the archives. I highly recommend that people check out his website. The Lithuanian State Historical Archives in the last couple years has put a lot of funding and resources towards getting those church books digitized and placed online. So there, I won't get the ending correct, but it's Epaveldas, Epaveldas, is kind of their digital repository that has a lot of the church records. So you can go in there and type in the name of your town that you found that your ancestor was born, if you know that that's also where the religious community was, if there was a church there that they would have belonged to, and see what records come up. A lot of them have been digitized already. The tricky thing about that is you have to use the proper noun form of the town. So what I do, because I don't speak Lithuanian, what I do is I go to the Lithuanian version of Wikipedia, and I type in the name of the town there, and usually an article on a place name on the Lithuanian version of Wikipedia includes all of the different noun cases that apply to the town. So depending on what kind of sentence structure you're trying to put together. And in there, you'll find the form of the town name that you can plunk into a Paveldas website in order to pull up the church records you're looking for. I know that sounds extremely complicated, but that's the way that I do it. And you should also, again, look at that Lithuanian Roman Catholic Ancestors.com website for additional help with that too.
So that's Lithuanian Roman Catholic Ancestors.com.
Yeah.
And I know that, is that also included in your handout, your syllabus?
Yes, there's a link to one of his guides on I think surname endings.
Okay, great. And again, the link to the syllabus for this webinar, if you'd like to purchase it on our online bookstore, I just dropped that link into the chat. It will also be in your follow-up email. And of course, as I mentioned at the start of the hour, this presentation has been recorded, so you can also go back starting later today on our website as well as our YouTube channel, and you can pause, you can take notes, and get the information that you need. Just a few more questions. David asks or says that he's been successful in hiring a professional to search the Lithuanian archive. Is there an organization that can kind of point us to other professionals for different areas?
Yeah, the website is the Association of Professional Genealogists. They have an ethical code that anyone who is going to advertise their services on that website has to meet that bar. And you can search their directory by research interests of the researchers and genealogists. You can specifically search for people who are based in Lithuania. And as you're going through that process, just pay attention to the geographic regions that they mention in their profiles. There's no point in hiring a researcher who lives in Lithuania but doesn't live anywhere near Vilnius, where the main archives are. So just kind of be wary of that kind of stuff. Look for, it's always appropriate to ask for references and things. Ask for previous reports that they've put together. Ultimately, if you're going to be transferring money over there and paying for this research, you want to make sure that it's done properly the first time.
Are there, here's another question for you. Are there specific suggestions for researching orphaned, married, divorced, or widowed women, since their maiden names are often lost, or is that assumption incorrect?
Do you think in Lithuania or in the United States?
Why don't you answer for both?
Okay. Yeah, divorce proceedings are a court matter in the United States, and there's usually information there about where the marriage occurred that was being dissolved. So that can be full of information. When it comes to orphan families, I think the hope is just that you'll be able to connect that person to their birth record from before they were orphaned. When it comes to researching in Lithuania, you're talking about a very religious area, a very Roman Catholic area in a lot of respects, and divorces were not very common. I would imagine anything like that would have been handled more as like an ecclesiastical manner. And so in the same way that the church books with all the births, marriages, and deaths were transferred to the archives, so too were the administrative records for the different parishes and dioceses and things like that. So you will occasionally get like little notations that you see in a birth, marriage, or death record that applies to some other administrative paperwork that accompanied the event. So that's sometimes a place to look. I mean, it's just a fact that researching orphaned people and following women after their maiden name has changed, that's just one of the more difficult parts about genealogy. Most of the records that are the easiest to track people with are geared towards men.
All right. And two final questions. One, David asks, any recommendations for being able to read and understand the cursive and sometimes hard to read handwriting on passenger lists or Ellis Island documents?
I know I've mentioned it several times, but Family Search, they have their own kind of Wikipedia called Family Search Wiki. And there's all kinds of helpful handwriting guides in there for deciphering things like passenger records or census records. You'll start to get a feel for the hands in a general time period. Census takers in the 1910 census tend to look a certain way because you're talking about people of a certain age who were educated in a system where they learned handwriting a certain way. That's not a hard and fast rule. But the other thing that's really helpful that I use on there is when I get to the point of trying to read some of the Russian records that are in Lithuania, there's a really helpful guide, again, on Family Search, that has the cursive alphabet, the Cyrillic cursive alphabet. And it takes a while, but you get used to it if you're looking at enough of these records where you start to read Cyrillic without being able to understand Russian. But a lot of these records are kind of formulaic. So if you realize where the village information is, the date information, and the names of the people in the record, you can start to effectively do genealogy in Russian records when you don't speak Russian.
And I can also recommend a webinar that we did earlier this year. Ann Lauthers did a 1-hour lecture on handwriting, and that's available. It's archived on our website and our YouTube channel. So definitely take a look at that. Finally, Christopher asks, are the Lithuanian archives available online?
Yes, check out that A Paveldes that I mentioned. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Even if it hasn't been digitized yet, you'll be able to access from their catalog at least information about which collection it rests in. Because obviously, if you're feeling confident and you want to attack some of those records written in Russian and they've been digitized, there's no point in hiring somebody in Lithuania to do that. However, if you did, it'll probably be faster and they probably would be more familiar with the place names that are coming up out of the records. But yes, a lot of stuff is continually getting digitized and put online. It's really great. The only problem is that there doesn't at this point exist like a central database of transcribed Lithuanian records. I mentioned there are some for Jewish vital records that have been some large-scale efforts that have gone towards that. But when I think about on the Polish side of things, there's a website called Genealogist, and they have Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Jewish parishes transcribed and indexed in a searchable database. It actually includes a lot of places in Lithuania too, because like I said, there were a lot of Poles, people who are ethnically Polish who were living in Lithuania. And so a lot of those parishes get covered, but we kind of lack that on the Lithuanian side of things. So my hope is that as more of this material ends up online, we'll have one of these centralized databases that will make it so much easier to identify your family and records.
All right. Well, thank you again, James, for a fantastic lecture. We have one person who's already asked if you're willing to do an intermediate or advanced webinar on the subject. So if anyone else is interested in that, or if there are other topics that you'd like us to focus on, whether it's Lithuanian or other areas in your family history research, please include that in the feedback survey. So as you leave today's event, you'll see a survey. And if you have the time, just fill it out, give us your feedback as we continue to expand our online offerings. Any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org. And best of luck in your research, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.